Good evening, folks. Welcome. I'm Ulises Mejias, and I am a professor at the State University of New York at Oswego, and also a member of the Board of Directors of Humanities New York. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's event. I do want to acknowledge and thank a couple of groups of people. We have a couple of members from our board of directors, so thank you very much for being here. And also I do want to acknowledge the amazing work that the Humanities New York staff has done to put this event together. I'm actually going to ask you to applaud and thank them. Especially Adam, but all of them have been incredibly helpful. If you don't mind, if you work for Humanities New York and you can just quickly raise your hand, that way people can sort of see you. If you have any questions about Humanities New York, please ask these folks after the event. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to describe a novella I read recently, and you have to guess which one it is. So it concerns the misfortunes of a young man whose idyllic and innocent upbringing is violently disrupted by war. Before we know it, everyone in his household has been brutally killed, including his young beloved, and he barely manages to escape his home. What follows is an increasingly fantastic tale as he travels through 3 continents, is recruited and then dismissed from an army, suffers religious persecution, is reunited with some of the people he thought were dead, including his sweetheart, loses them again, acquires immense wealth, has it stolen from him, and encounters enough destruction, dishonesty, prejudice, religious and racial bigotry, war, rape, dismemberment, corruption, cannibalism, earthquakes, and tsunamis to make Game of Thrones seem like a children's book. The story in question is Candide by Voltaire, and it was published in 1759. The subtitle of Candide is The Optimist. And this short story is a satirical and savage treatise on the view that no matter what happens, everything will be fine. Candide and his companions, including the pedantic tutor, Professor Pangloss, go from one horrific situation to an even more extreme one, thinking that, yes, the world can be a bit mean at times, but in the end, everything will work out. The more cruel and inhumane the world seems to get, the more we are tempted to embrace Panglossian optimism. But we are reaching 2 important thresholds that Voltaire didn't have to worry about 265 years ago. 2 points of no return. The disruption of environmental balances that make it possible to maintain certain kinds of life on our planet, and the disruption of certain balances in our psyches that make it possible to maintain certain kinds of social relations with each other. Technology is responsible for getting us close to both of those points of no return, which is why we are gathered here today. To disrupt our Panglossian faith in big tech, we have with us 2 thinkers whose conversation with each other will, I am sure, teach us a thing or two about how to respond critically when we hear that technology will save us, even if it has to eliminate some of us in the process. Jenny Odell is writer and artist based in Oakland. She is the author of 2 important books, How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, and more recently, Saving Time, Discovering a Life Beyond the Clock. Nathan Schneider is an assistant professor at the University of Colorado Boulder and founder of the Media Economies Design Lab. He is the author of various articles and 4 books, the most recent one being Governable Spaces, Democratic Design for Online Life. To better understand why their views are so important, let me tell you how Candide ends. And the statute of limitations on spoiler alerts, I guess, doesn't apply to works that are 265-year-old. So by finally letting go of his uncritical optimism, Candide does not necessarily become a happier person. How can he, after all the horror that he has witnessed? He and the surviving members of his crew find a little remote farm and decide that the best way to live in this crazy world is simply to dedicate themselves to cultivating their garden, each applying his or her own talents. This might seem like a disappointing cop-out, but as I read Jenny's and Nathan's work, I recognize some powerful advice. Jenny Odell suggests that there is nothing as powerful and perhaps as difficult as deciding how to cultivate our time. Nothing as radical and as active as doing nothing. And Nathan Schneider reminds us that we can be active participants in defining the rules that govern our technological environments, just as his own mom's community garden club does, as he writes at the beginning of his book. Both Jenny and Nathan, in other words, remind us of what post-colonial thinker Ashish Nandy calls the power of the non-player. The non-player is not someone who abdicates responsibility, but someone who refuses to play by someone else's rules. He was, of course, speaking specifically about British colonialism in India. In this age of techno-Panglossianism, we need to claim these powers instead of delegating them to machines, which are increasingly becoming the surrogates of other people's greed and dehumanized politics. Tending our garden means, to me at least, reorienting our ontological connection to the world. Thinking at the small scale determined by our small lives, how to spend our time being with each other and shaping each other. To get some gardening tips from two insightful authors, let us now welcome Jenny and Nathan. Thank you.
Thank you for such a beautiful introduction. That sets a really high ambition for this conversation, which I'm grateful for. And I also just want to express some gratitude for all those who made this event possible and all of you who've come to be part of my opportunity to kick something off my bucket list, which is to have a conversation with Jenny Odell. I want to start with a question that leaps from the front matter of her latest book, your latest book, Saving Time, which is it's dedicated to your family, broadly conceived. Mm-hmm. Who do you mean by that?
I think I mean kind of like partners in the struggle, I guess. I think that Saving Time was technically it's my third book, but really I consider it my second book because the second book is very small. But I think enough time had passed where I kind of could start to identify a larger pattern or maybe like a larger argument that like I'm part of trying to work on. Whereas How to Do Nothing, I mean, I really wrote it in a sort of blissful naivete and was drawing more kind of from my own personal experiences. And by the time Saving Time came around, it was sort of like I had met or made contact with a sort of network of people in all disciplines, like expected and unexpected. And I think that was really important to me because something I still think about a lot is like how impossible anything feels when you're trying to you're thinking about it from a place of isolation. Even if you know a lot or you've thought about it a lot, if you don't see yourself as kind of like connected to this larger thing, it just feels impossible and you'll just like shut down. And so I feel like I guess that's sort of, and I also mean the sort of the project very broadly, like even just people who find it worthwhile to make art is in that bucket, right? Like just people who are kind of invested in certain values that I see as endangered, and we all are kind of working on together. Yeah.
You also mentioned Beavis and Butthead like twice, like once in the text and then once in the footnote.
Oh,
and
yeah.
you refer back to it. And I'm just wondering, like, is that part of the milieu that maybe we share?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I think also, thank you for reading the like, Saving Time has endnotes, footnotes, and footnotes with endnotes.
Footnotes are, all the notes are the best.
Yeah, there's a lot. I put a lot of, and I was like, no one is going to read these. So yeah, I guess I do come back to Beavis and Butthead much later on in one of the footnotes. Yeah, but I think it's a characteristic of my writing that I kind of like grabbed from all different kinds of examples, which I think came from teaching art to non-art majors typically. And I think, you know, like I'll use whatever is at hand or whatever comes to mind. And I also, the first mention of Beavis and Butthead comes in the half of the book that is potentially very depressing. Because it's about the history of how we came to see time as money, and that's a story of colonialism, that's a story of, you know, like plantation slavery, factories, like extremely exploitative, you know, circumstances, and then the second chapter is about how we've internalized some of that and how we see our own time, and so I think I also maybe was trying to bring some levity to that part of the book.
No, I mean, I think you need the levity. I've been trying to figure out the 90s right now because, like, baggy pants are back and everyone's wearing, like, there are more Nirvana shirts made in 2024 than in 1992, you know, probably
Yeah.
by orders of magnitude, right?
Yeah.
You know
Yeah.
what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And I'm trying to understand, like, why is this moment back? And I was talking to my students about the 90s, right? Like, what's the book that everybody, you know, the kind of great punching bag of the 90s, like the end of history.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
It was a certain end of history, right? This moment where, you know, the Cold War had been won, and maybe, you know, it was kind of politically an optimistic moment in certain respects in the United States. This image that, like, oh, we've figured it all out. Clinton, you know, can just like cruise into the sunset. But actually, the culture was like, you know, what did you quote him saying, like, do less shit?
Oh yeah, it's like someone ordering, like making this really long order at like the fast food restaurant, and then he just goes like, ... Could you like get less stuff?
Get less stuff.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was the one who introduced the bad word. But I think there's something about, like, the folks are facing a different kind of end of history now. You know, one in which, you know, we accept climate chaos. I had to make a rule in my class the other day where we're doing, like, science fiction, like no dystopias, because the dystopias were just the default mode. And so, you know, as you know, this is what we're up against, and I think this is part of, like, what that fashion expresses, is that kind of return to a moment of an end of history, a politics that is just, like, profoundly out of touch, and a set of crises that people living their lives just, like, can't figure out how to work through, and you know, so I think the question before us is, like, you know, what do we offer, you know, in that context, in yet another end of history.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, because something I have noticed, I wrote How to Do Nothing. I mean, I really wrote it in 2018. It came out in 2019. It's based on a talk I gave in 2017, but it was in response to the 2016 election. And so it's been some time, and on the one hand, I'm still surprised and grateful at how much it caught on, and, you know, like, I had a lot of people tell me, like, you're describing a feeling that I've had for so long, and it was like you pinned a butterfly or something. Like, it was just, like, really cathartic to see that described. And there were, like, conversations about, you know, like how bad it felt to just be, like, interacting, like, with the attention economy with such intensity all the time, and that's why I think, like, the book took off. But then when I really, like, I think about it, and it's like I feel like between now and then, some people have just accepted it. I don't know. It's like people already accepted it at the time, but when I, you know, like, especially, I mean, yeah, like, I just did an event at a college, and it was like everyone was on their phones, and there was this kind of like the idealism of wanting anything different than that was almost like out of style in a way to what you're saying. And so I feel like there's like there's that to deal with, right? There's like the apathy, like a kind of like cultural apathy, and like it's a lot of work and takes a lot of energy, and you need a lot of other people to begin to imagine something else or to want something else.
Okay, so another question that comes out of that particular, right, I think before you talk about Beavis and Butthead, you talk about Fred Moten, right?
About?
Fred Moten.
Oh, Fred Moten, yeah.
So Fred Moten is this scholar and poet and so many things, who talks about study. Talks about study not as like a room or just a kind of simple task, but as actually a radical act, a way of coming together and working through liberation, in his case, in the tradition of Black liberation. And so that provokes me the question of how you study. Moten is someone who we've read in a center we have at CU Boulder, where we meet every week and read text together, and that kind of community has been really deeply animating for my work in recent years, and I'm wondering what your practice of study is as you piece together these books that are, in so many ways, these just beautiful kind of scrapbooks in the highest sense.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that it kind of it all starts with a feeling. Like, I think I'm one of those people who writes from like sort of the inside of something. And so when I no longer teach, but when I was writing How to Do Nothing, I taught, again, non-art majors at Stanford, which is a very, that's an intense competitive atmosphere for those students. And I was observing sort of a feeling among them, but also in myself, I think it's important to say. And so that's kind of like that provides like the framework. Like, it's just sort of this, like, I have a feeling, I'm trying to understand it. And again, I will kind of like grab whatever will help me here. So some of it was just conversations with my students or just people I know. And then once in a while, someone will just like mention a source to me that I've not heard of, and then I will go into the works cited of that and just kind of go on this long branching path. And then at some point it becomes like almost a pathological thing where it's like everything I experience is somehow related. Like, there's a movie that I mentioned in How to Do Nothing that I was essentially dragged to away from working on the book. Like, it's like, no, you need to do something else, and then it ended up being very relevant, and it's in the book. So it's kind of like walking around with this kind of lens, and then it means, I'm always, anyone I talk to, I just end up talking about that. It's probably really annoying at a certain point, but I think that's how all these kind of unexpected things like end up in this kind of collection. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, is that similar for you? Like,
yeah, I think that mode of turning everything into material is something that happens when you hit a stride, I think of it as lenses. Like, when I was writing a book about cooperatives, I could just like see cooperatives everywhere around me, the remnants of cooperation in our world. Like, what's that tower in the small town in the distance? Oh, that's the old cooperative grain silo. And what's that Visa card you have in your pocket? Oh, there was a time when Visa was a cooperative. It's just like all these histories start to texture our world, and you start to see the world as made of different stuff than we've been told. And that too, is part of the kind of lenses I put on for my more recent work, which is about everyday democracy, which is like drew me into this question of how do we practice democracy, like practice in the sense of like practicing violin, like how are we practicing or practicing against democracy or self-governance or our own power in our lives? What little things can we notice that are actually turning us away from our own power? And I think time is really crucial for that, like noticing also noticing also where we turn time into a politics, where we recognize time as something that that is not just, you know, a way of getting from here to there, but is actually a space and a possibility, and something that we might fight for and that we might talk about. And there's something so necessary and courageous and weird, I think, even about talking about time today, because it has been so profoundly depoliticized. This used to be one of the central sites of struggle in labor movements, for instance, right? Demanding shorter working hours in, you know, struggles that happen not so far from here, often led by women workers, demanding and fighting for 10-hour days and then 8-hour days. And time was understood as, you know, a crucial site of struggle. We so rarely see that around us anymore, and it's a kind of seeing that we lose. And I love how you bring that kind of, that visual character to it. The book is full of images, both, you know, graphic and textual, that invite us back into that politics as a way of seeing.
Yeah. I think, I mean, I love Modern Times, the film, 1936, I think, because it kind of like, for anyone who hasn't seen it, there's a part where Charlie Chaplin, who's like on the assembly line trying to keep up with it, that's like kind of the famous scene. Right after that, this guy is brought, like some kind of, a guy who has a company where they have this device that will eliminate the lunch hour. And actually, one of the earliest factory strikes that I mention in my book was actually a strike about them trying to eliminate the lunch hour, like in real life. And so anyway, this machine is like, you kind of wheel it up to someone who's supposed to still be working, and it rotates this platter with like a soup with its own spoon that's spooning the soup into your face. And then the funniest one is like a corn cob that's like spinning, but it malfunctions, and so it's like spinning really fast, and it's like hitting Charlie Chaplin in the face. But it's like you watch that now, and I make the comparison in the book between that and a 2018 short film by Keiichi Matsudo that's of a sort of nameless woman who's at a kind of like futuristic looking wraparound workspace, and the film itself is actually 360. So you yourself watching it on YouTube can scroll around and see that she's entirely surrounded by these kind of floating screens. And she's doing some kind of like customer service job, and she's just like trying to keep up with all of these windows that are popping up. There's like an evil version of Clippy from Microsoft like in the corner. She's like taking supplements, and she says something like, you know, there's not always time to eat lunch, but there's so many innovative ways to fuel your mind and body. And it's like that. I mean, I'm from the Bay Area. Like I grew up in like between Cupertino and San Jose. Like that is unquestioned. Like, as you know, like that's just, like the question isn't like whether, it's like how much, or like how fast, or like how well are you going to run your time material through your machine, you know? Yeah.
I was once at a Silicon Valley thing where it was, you know, people were doing their talks and doing their startups or whatever, and there were people cooking in the back. And at one point, they just stopped cooking and they came out into the main room, and they had these beautiful things they'd written, and they just kind of read it out. Like, you're destroying. You know, there were people who were interested in like processed food startups. They're like, you're destroying something very precious to us. Food is our life, it's our culture. Yeah. And it was amazing to see the cooks just like halt the goings on and insist amazing. Like take some time and insist like, no, you're enclosing something that really matters to us, a commons that is ours.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I mean, it also makes me think of this, there's like a subreddit and I don't remember it's an acronym, but it's like something like high income early retirement or something. It's like people trying to figure out how to make a ton of money, like by whatever means necessary, so they can retire early. And so in the subreddit, someone's like, you know, I've automated this and this and this, and I've hired people to do these and these things, but what about these other, I forget what was left, but they're asking about how they can hire someone to do that, and people have answers, but then one of the answers was like, I think you should be really careful because like pretty soon you will have like a meaningless life. Basically, like you will have automated everything in your entire life, and then what is left? Like you're not thinking about like what's going to happen when you get to that point. And I feel like that's kind of, food is a really good example of that.
Yeah. No, I wonder, like, if you imagine, a question for me always is like, what kind of collectivity can come out of the ideas that we build? What kind of things can we do together? And, I have a kind of, I take a lot of guidance from history. I take a lot of inspiration from it. I take a lot of my hope that we can actually change things from times when people have actually changed things. And I try to study those stories, but sometimes I get too locked in that, like, is it just reviving, the 19th century labor movement to reclaim time, right? Will that work? What does, for instance, the topic of my latest book, Governable Spaces, is about, what does democracy look like online? Okay, do we just import the things that we're doing already? Or does it require something new? When you imagine, like, what would it take to take back time, to repoliticize time, to make time something that we can actually change our relationship with together? Does that require kind of new forms? Does it require looking back? Do we know how to do this?
I think that it's really important to look back, kind of what you just said, but, to recover even the sense of possibility. I think like one of the great risks of being trapped in a sort of like doom scroll or whatever you want to call it, it's extremely present, or it involves like a dread of the future. It's not necessarily looking backwards, and there's this, there's a risk that one would feel like alone with this unprecedented struggle that doesn't have any sort of roots in history. And it's something I've noticed. It's just a coincidence. I have a lot of friends who are in their 70s, or just like I have a lot of intergenerational friendships, and that has kind of the opposite effect, where it's like they're like, like we worked on this, and it wasn't even that long ago. So just kind of like having ties, whether that's through like just learning about these older movements or just talking to people, I think that's a really important just like first step for feeling like there is like some energy and something to be done. And then I also feel that there's just something really important about talking, like just, to go back to study, something that I observed among my students was that there was this kind of like, actually both in my students and then I think the writer's strike in Hollywood, you kind of see the same thing, like people who feel like I'm so lucky to be here, maybe I'm being exploited, but like I think that's just kind of how it is, and I need to keep my head down, and there's something wrong with me that I'm like not able to keep up with this, like I can't work when I'm sick, like whatever. And there's, as long as you have those blinders on, you could just continue like that until you burn out, basically. And so I think that there's also a really important first step of just like talking to other people and finding out that even just one other person feels the same way that you do. And then maybe that's the beginning of something, whether that's like a traditional union or something else. Like I think, like I have a little bit in Saving Time about gig workers, like international gig workers, organizing in ways that are different. They have to be different because the organizations are different. But I think that important part, just kind of like, picking your head up and then just like talking to like one other person.
Mm. Yeah, the choices we make about those histories really matter too. One thing that I've noticed a lot in critical discourses about technology recently is there is a kind of reclaiming of the Luddites going on, right? And this is, a labor movement essentially among weavers, textile workers in early 19th century England. Today you say, okay, you're a Luddite, it means like you don't want technology or something. These were people whose lives were being destroyed by the early industrial system, and their craft was being automated and made crappier and cheaper and driving them out of business. And so they organize at night and march around in circles and practice kind of military drills, really well-organized people who would go into these factories and break the looms. And they were very intentional about what they broke and all these sorts of things. And there is a fascination with that moment, and some really been a couple of books in recent years coming out about retelling the story of the Luddites in light of, for instance, like gig workers resisting today. And I've been really kind of moved by that interest in these stories. But one thing I realized that hadn't occurred to me is that actually, like, the tradition that I've been very much working in out of the last decade, the cooperative tradition, businesses owned and governed by the people who use them, had its start, at least in England in its modern form, actually from the next generation of those same weavers in the same region.
Oh, wow.
Right? Is that they, after the army had come in and crushed that Luddite movement, a generation or so passed, and in 1844 was the founding of the Rochdale store near Manchester, where those textile workers built their own store that they could shop at, that they co-owned, and then eventually built lots of stores, and those stores together built their own textile factories, right? And I think it's kind of striking that, as I realize that there's actually a continuity there, that the story that I hear told a lot right now is like the breaking, but not the reclaiming, not the owning, that we don't even begin to ask, like, how would we do this differently if we were in charge? How would we organize, say, an attention economy if we had to make those hard choices,
right,
about the balance between, like, a little bit of entertainment and a doom scroll? Yeah.
I feel like I should also mention, or this is the place to mention, the coincidental connection, I feel like, between, so How to Do Nothing, at the end I mentioned Mastodon, and then just kind of gesture toward it as like a decentralized network. And then I joined Mastodon, and then I changed instances, I guess, right? To the one that did you co-found it, right? Yeah. And so I pay like a pound a month or something, and I haven't
pounds.
I haven't gone to any meetings, but I have a stake in it, and I
got to get you on a committee.
And so I feel like that's, and there's some ways in which, like, I feel like I almost want, like, someone who reads How to Do Nothing to read Governable Spaces next, because I kind of, like, I'm gesturing in a direction, but I don't really have, like, the knowledge to go there or the experience. And then there's so much in Governable Spaces about, like, the doing, after the breaking, the doing. And you really do get the sense of this kind of collective decision-making, often very difficult, as like a muscle that is, like, underdeveloped for a lot of people, certainly myself.
Yeah, no, it really is. It's a wonderful muscle when you start to play with it. So that, just for those not familiar with Mastodon, my relationship with this came, first I was part of a group that back in 2016 saw that there was a danger that somebody could buy Twitter and really mess it up. And I was a journalist at that time, and Twitter was a really important part of my life. Like, especially during the Arab Spring was when I first really fell for it, because I was a social movement reporter, and this was a way of finding things and pulling together stories and finding sources that just it became indispensable for me. So I had a stake, and at the time, Twitter was vulnerable to a takeover, and a group of us got together and realized, hey, if we pool some resources here, we actually have enough stock in this company to put forward a shareholder resolution. So we put forward a shareholder resolution at Twitter. They tried to fight us at the SEC, they failed, and what we called for is Twitter should explore forms of democratic ownership. What would it look like if this utility were actually owned like a utility? Like, say, the Associated Press, a vital utility in the news industry in the United States and around the world that's cooperatively owned, going back to the 1830s. And so we ended up getting like 4% of the vote or whatever, but a group of us were like, okay, we're not done. And we found that, there's a new open source, free social network that has just come out called Mastodon. And it looks like Twitter, but it is something you can run on your own server and connect with other people's servers. And so it's a different vision for what social media could be like. And a lot of the people who worked on building the standards that Mastodon works on came out of marginalized experiences, especially queer experiences online, and had experienced a lot of the negative sides of online life today. And they tried to build a network where they could really control their experience. And so what social.coop was, this, which we formed out of this group that tried to buy Twitter, and this was our second best, is, okay, we're gonna create our own Twitter-like experience, and we're gonna co-govern it, and we're gonna allocate we're gonna pool our money and decide how to spend it, and make decisions about moderation for ourselves. And it is some work, but it's the kind of work I like to do, Like, I don't like going to my credit union's meetings or whatever, like that's not where my mind goes. But I do like participating in this because it lets us ask those hard questions about, where do we draw the lines about what we want to see in our feeds? How are we going to relate to, Meta, which is now coming into the Fediverse, the network of these alternative networks with threads. And that's it's a new question to get to ask yourself, is what would I do?
Yeah, and it is getting to ask it, because I think an experience that I had joining Mastodon, or joining social.coop in particular, and then I thought about even more reading your book, was like the experience, even before you make any of those decisions, of realizing how many decisions are being made for you. Yeah. And of course that's really obvious now. I mean, it's like the Twitter just made it impossible to block people, basically, right? I mean, like, you can block someone, but they can still see all your stuff, and it's like there are periodically these reminders where everyone realizes how little control they have, where otherwise you can sort of get used to it. And so even just being asked, right, like, how would you do it, or what do you want? It's like there's this kind of like moment where, like, oh, I'm not used to being asked that. I'm not used to, like, I have to think about that for a while. But it's like, it's very, it feels like so dignified compared to using Twitter or Instagram, where it's just like, I am literally just like a peon here, Yeah.
And the veil is coming off on these big platforms. I mean, one thing I identify a bit is this sense in which the platform power is starting to become, like, converge with political power in a really weird way in the last few years. Right, and I think that this has been a long time coming. We've actually been developing this kind of comfort with authoritarian life because we live it in our online lives. It's just part of how we do things, whether we're talking about a tiny group chat where one person is the absolute admin who gets to control who gets to be there and what they say, or when we're talking about a big company. And I think the purchase of Twitter this time around with Elon Musk, it's, gone is even the claim that these social networks in particular are like open platforms. Oh, we're just a neutral space, like platform, like the stage, that's the word they chose to make it seem like, oh, you can do whatever you want on it. Now it's like, oh no, this is my town now, right? And also notice, like, what did Donald Trump do the second he left office as president? He became an admin of a social network, Truth Social, right? The images in our minds of what a powerful person is are just converging between the politicians and the platforms, and there's this kind of sense in which the gloves are coming off. And there's a kind of willingness to embrace the kind of naked power in the same way that I think we see in geopolitics today. The rules-based international order, which was always kind of a farce, is just going completely out the window, and there is this embrace of raw power and an increasing willingness to dispense with any pretense about it, and it just it again poses the question to us of, you know, how do we find our humanity in moments like this? How do we, you know, reclaim other sites of power?
Yeah, totally. And I think, I mean, one thing I really love about governable spaces is the kind of the politics and poetics of like the everyday, like finding those moments, like however small, however banal, where you are exercising some kind of, like you're making a democratic, you know, collective decision where just you feel some sort of agency, or you are answering questions and kind of like using those as starting points. I just read an advanced copy of Robin Wall Kimmerer's next book. It's called The Service Berry. It's about the gift economy, and it's kind of has a similar, it uses a similar tactic of just kind of like, okay, like we all understand the library, like we all understand, or even just like, I'm done with this book, you can have it. Like these like really kind of small, granular experiences that embody values that are actually quite different from these ones that are just bearing down on you all the time. And so I think like I have a lot of faith in like that kind of like the experience, because I think you can read about something all day and you can see all the Instagram infographics that you could see, but there's really no substitute for just like having an experience with a group of people where you change something, however big. Like that is a form of education that there is like no substitute for.
I think that's so true. And you know, when I ask myself, like, why do I care about democracy, for instance, or economic democracy, I think back to experiences I had like early in life, you know, where somebody said, hey, you know, take some power, and I got to you know, share that with others and accomplish little things. And you know, I struggle with that sometimes because there is a kind of danger of a kind of inward-looking. You know, there's a lot of discourse in certain circles, very much where I live, of like, oh, you got to fix yourself before you can like do anything in the world. So like, do a ton of meditation and then like come back in a few decades and we'll talk, right? I think that's, you know, kind of tactic of oppression, really. And but I do think there is a way of talking about the relationship between the everyday and the larger scale sources of sites of power that we really, really need. Alexis de Tocqueville was really, really insistent on this in his understanding of American democracy in the 1830s. Oh, the reason why this is not falling apart entirely is because people are in civic associations organizing every day. Like that is what holds this stuff together. And then when you look at anti-colonial movements, you see the same thing from like Frantz Fanon or Gandhi. All of these thinkers and strategists and actors were really insistent on the need to build, cultivate self-governing spaces in the process of resistance. You know, Gandhi would insist like 90% of this is what he called the constructive program, the stuff that, you know, the spinning wheels and the village cooperatives and the things that seem insignificant. I've heard it from civil rights elders in the South, you know, who are like, look, everyone wants to talk about the big visible protests and the lunch counters, but we were also organizing credit unions and just weaving together community, because that's how you build lasting power. And to me, part of my interest in the digital spaces comes out of seeing protest movements fail in digital life. You know, fail is maybe not the best word for it, but seeing movements fall short of the aspirations that the people in them themselves had, particularly, you know, in the context of movements like the many manifestations of what started with the Arab Spring in 2011, here, Occupy, these sorts of things, and then into some other later movements to some degree, Black Lives Matter and others, where the reliance on online spaces created this ability to spread a message, but not the ability to hold power in the longer term. And that challenge of how do we actually build those durable sites? We're really good at the 10%, the flashy stuff online, and it's really, these spaces are really good for that. But how do we build the deep work, the spaces for the kind of deep power and organizing that allows us to outlast the powers that we're up against?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And there's a study that I cite towards the end of How to Do Nothing by Veronica Barassi, who was interviewing people in the 15M movement in Spain about their experiences with social media. And essentially, I feel like there's like three big problems that she identifies, but one of them that I feel like is the most important is just like speed, or like time and speed, and also like a form of censorship that's not like literally being censored, but you're being buried by new information all the time. So you end up having to do these you have to put so much energy into doing the flashy stuff, just like capturing people's attention over and over. Like just so much energy goes into that, which is also, a narrowing of the message, like in order to, because you only have so many like seconds, right? But she also talks about the importance of slower media, like magazines, something where someone is allowed to fully formulate a thought, and then people are allowed to have time to discuss the thought and formulate a response. I feel like I've even seen like recently, I've seen this like in, I can't remember which magazine, but someone like wrote a long thing, and then the next issue, someone wrote a long response to that, and then they wrote a long, and they're very like considered and articulate, even though they very much disagree. And I'm like, oh, this is like the dialogue that I am missing, like when I am on social media platforms where it's like, no one has time for that amount of complexity, and also all you ever see in terms of disagreement is like a dunk, and then you never hear from the other person again. It's just like, this is a complete shutdown. And so I thought that was really, and I think that study was done quite some time ago, so it's probably even more so.
It's less likely to happen when you might be in a working group meeting with that person on social media in a few days, Yeah. For sure, there's some accountability.
Yeah.
Well, a couple things about the 15M movement. I remember when I was reporting on planning meetings that led to Occupy Wall Street, some folks from 15M from Spain were there. They showed up and they said, okay, we've got a couple things for you. One is there's this thing called live streaming. And this was new at the time. And but they were not just using some company's platform. They had set up the servers and were controlling their own live streaming system. And they were like, we are gonna control our own media. We are gonna manage how we tell our story. And so that was a first gift. And it was one that the Occupy in the US didn't end up really holding on to fully. They ended up adopting a lot of other things, putting things on other platforms, and losing control of that message. Another thing that the 15M folks, I remember standing in the middle of occupied Zuccotti Park in downtown, and one of the 15M, one of the women from 15M was just like looking around, just being like, okay, when are we gonna go back to the neighborhoods? Because after about a month in Spain, the movements decided, okay, we're not gonna wait for the police to drive us out of here. It's gonna happen eventually. We're gonna go back to the neighborhoods and organize. And as a result, there are all kinds of things you can say critical about that, but some of that movement's outgrowth did take both local and political power in Spain in the subsequent years, and have left a lasting imprint on it. One of the most, I think, extraordinary experiments in digital democracy led by a government was the experiments out of Barcelona that came out of a government that was attached to that protest movement. And that's what it can look like when you take that energy and turn it toward everyday organizing where people are. And it becomes durable. It becomes harder to just snuff out. Our networks are designed for spreading messages quickly and then moving on to the next product, right? And if we want something different, we have to build them for ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that in part is why I make a lot of comparisons in How to Do Nothing between sort of like online experiences online and ecology. Like I think at some point I compare like Twitter to just like a flood that takes over an area that doesn't have any plants to keep it from eroding or something like that. And I've been volunteering recently in a native plant restoration group in the East Bay, and that has become even more real to me because I'm with a group of people and we're working on this collective project, but also it's so much about, it's not really about individual species, it's about recreating ties that got lost in order to create like an overall ecosystem in that area that's resilient, like resilient to fire, resilient to storms, which there's more and more of. And I still think that that's a really good image for like a social kind of resistance to erosion or whatever you want to call it, like something that can like actually stay in place. And that's the other reason I feel like someone should read your book after mine, is because I think I'm kind of starting to go in that direction in How to Do Nothing, of sort of like, okay, I'm describing the attention economy, how it feels, like how it's impossible to sort of complete a thought and all of the reasons for that. And then the second half of the book is about bioregionalism essentially, and becoming like, taking your attention out of this thing and planting it in something that feels more resilient. And I feel like I'm kind of like leading in this direction of like this here, where there are also other people who have like a common interest in this thing with you.
Yeah, one of my favorite pieces of recent science fiction is this novel, A Half-Built Garden by Ruth Hannah Emery's. It kind of takes our books and smushes them together, right? It imagines this world in which the United States is kind of this kind of non-functional bureaucracy that just keeps on going, but nobody really cares. And what actually holds power are these bioregional, like watershed-based networks, where the characters are constantly like, oh, let me consult my network. And when they have to make big decisions, because aliens come, and so they have to make like decisions for the fate of the Earth. And so they're like, okay, network, how should I approach this? And because the network is built with governance structures as part of its design, they can actually get that kind of feedback and feel accountable. The experience that started me down the path of writing this book was I was trying to run a large mailing list, and someone was being a jerk on the internet, and I just realized I have no idea how I can actually decide accountably, make the right decision. Like, what power do I actually have? Should I call a vote? We don't have any framework for that. And meanwhile, my mother, who is part of a neighborhood garden club and had just been elected president, showed me her bylaws. And I've never been in an online space that has bylaws, right? That has actually built that basic foundation for how to self-govern. And that just got me going on the question of how is it that we how is it that we forgot to ask ourselves how to share power in these online spaces, and to be able to embed that in our ecosystems and also in our metaphors. I'm somebody who I know. We both have read Adrienne Marie Brown, who's a philosopher and science fiction writer and an activist, uses a lot of metaphors about mycelia, mushrooms, fractals. She's very attentive to metaphors that invite us to embed our systems and our ways of organizing into an ecological vision, into recognizing ourselves as part of something that is not just human. And even just the metaphors that we choose for how we share power and how power flows are a starting point for shifting that relationship to nature.
Yeah. Also, when I read that part about the bylaws, it reminded me, there is a part of How to Do Nothing where I talk about communes, and like largely sort of communes that didn't last very long, and people are always kind of like, they don't like the vibe and they're just moving on constantly to the next one. And in the context of the book, it's sort of like, this is what happens if you just kind of try to walk away from everything, like just throw your phone in the ocean but there was a commune. I know that there are also successful communes that are and were, And one of them that I found, it's in like far northern, I think it's in like the Klamath Mountains in Northern California. Their sort of constitution is on their website, and it's not very long. I mean, it's detailed enough. It contains provisions about how often it will be revisited. They're very clear about you have to come to those meetings. Those are not optional, which is really important. But it's also this really interesting kind of like accumulation of clearly like things that have happened. So like you don't drive a car in here if you can't get it out. Like clearly, obviously that happened at some point, you know. And so it just becomes like this kind of like collection of like, well, we experienced that and we learned from it, and this is what we learned, and it just keeps like adding. And so it's like this living document. And I was like, oh, right, like that's why this commune, which I think is from, you know, the late 60s, still exists. And it also kind of made me realize that this kind of document is its own form of technology in a way. Like it's an apparatus, it's external to us, it was designed, it allows you to do things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So I really admired that, yeah.
Yeah, you know, I think there's something about that commune movement that, you know, tried to, I think you're onto something around that sense of like trying to remove yourself entirely from the world and to create an entirely new world. And I'm kind of a junkie of monasteries. I go to monasteries a lot, like particularly in Catholic traditions. And you know, one thing that's enabled that particular protocol of life to endure in certain respects is like it requires a lot of submission, right? It's a kind of authoritarian space that also has its own sites of democracy, but it requires a kind of positive virtue of submission. And I think that we need to approach the challenge in our world today less around how can we totally depart from the world and create a new kind of singular logic, and instead recognize the possibility of what the indigenous scholar Glenn Coulthard calls non-exclusive sovereignty. You know, I think we have put too much in one system, whether it's our commune or our country, right? And everything depends, once again, on this election. Everything depends on what this country can do, but actually the fact is no country, including this one, can solve the crises we're up against. They can't govern big tech. They can't govern, they can't solve climate change. These are global challenges. We need new kind of, new/old ways of confronting these challenges. And I think that the image of non-exclusive sovereignties I think of is that this image on this website, nativeland.ca, where you see indigenous territories that are overlapping. You know, I live on the land there of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. You know, all people who are able to live in different ways upon the same land. Similarly, I think, you know, with our digital networks and with our ecosystems, we have the opportunity to create spaces of governance that don't necessarily map onto our violent borders, you know, that don't map onto these imaginary lines that we've drawn in the sand, but allow us to, you know, to build collectivity and solidarity. You know, the reason that we use pounds in, you know, social.coop is that it's legally housed in a cooperative in the UK because we have members all over the world. And so I get to be democratic with people, you know, who don't live within, you know, the same violent borders that I live within. And that, you know, that creates an opening. And, you know, one thing I wanted to ask you about too is, you know, you talked about writing in the context, I think in How to Do Nothing, in the context of the 2016 election. Given the books you've written out of that experience, you know, how do you find yourself approaching the political moment we're in now?
I think one thing that the experience of writing, I mean, both books has underscored for me kind of going into this is that there's like such a huge divide between the way discourse appears online and how people really have conversations. Like I have so little faith in like and some people would somehow make it work sometimes, but like the amount of the kind of exchange that is possible to have online on the platforms that we have is just garbage in my opinion. And again, there are exceptions to that, but it's not set up for that. And I just see like this, I feel like there's been this like widening gap between the sort of like the tone and the sort of lack of mutual respect and lack of nuance and all of that kind of stuff online, and then like when you have a conversation with like literally anyone. Even like, I remember around 2016, my boyfriend and I were on a train, and it was when you still had the dining cars and you just were randomly across from someone, and we were across from this guy from Oklahoma and his grandson, and it was like, I don't know, it was like pretty clear that they were very conservative. But there we were there for an hour, and
I love those dining halls.
Yeah, it was like, it wasn't an easy conversation, but it was very different from me like looking at any sort of person's, the kinds of expressions that people even make in the first place online because they know that they get traction or like they do well with the algorithms, like is so different. And I just feel like that gap is like so wide at this point, it's surreal to me. Like it's just completely like different realities. And so, yeah, I really just like, I just feel like I just don't know what's going on. Like this is my general feeling.
Totally. There was that song that was kind of a couple of years ago that kind of took the kind of conservative media by storm, the Try That in a Small Town song, had some real problem, some things that, I really didn't go for in it. And yet the basic idea, I think has some power to it, which is like, when you live in a place where you're generally accountable to people because it's small enough that you know each other, like there is a different dynamic. It doesn't mean stuff can't be really, really toxic and all kinds of like the worst parts of our nature come out, but there is a structure of accountability, and there is something that I think human beings need and can process. And to me, one way of asking the question is just like, what are the normal ways that we organize our lives and our social structures, right? Like the idea that Meta has one rule book for the entire world, like that is the fundamental problem, right? Or that is a fundamental, it's at least an expression of the fundamental problem, is that the desire to govern the whole world as one. That is the the expression of the imperial logic of these companies. In contrast to like, you go from town to town or state to state, we have different ways of governing our schools. We have different like court systems. We have, when you start a new small town or whatever, you don't just like import the rule book from the next town over and let them run you. You set up your own school board, you set up your own local stuff. Like that is how we do things in every other aspect of life except digital platforms. And it's those exceptions that I'm always interested in. Like where are the ways in which, without noticing, we've actually just like discarded all of our embodied wisdom about how to self-govern the second we went online. And we allowed companies to actually turn that lack of norms and habits and muscle memory into a means of control.
Yeah. I think what? Oh, well, I was just gonna say that was well said. I don't know. I guess I do have like one, I mean, it's sort of a question, but like I think all the time about my friend who essentially, I mean, she's kind of in a co-living situation, but she's more or less a single mother. And I remember her asking me from her perspective about the attention economy, because at the time her kid was like, whatever is like the age where it's like peak demanding your attention all the time, like 3 or 4. And she was like, I am just tired at the end of the day, and I like go on TikTok or whatever. And I think that's something you hear a lot, is like, it's either you're literally tired or you're like spiritually tired. Like you're just like, I can't. And I wonder a lot about, like, I have some vague ideas, but about like where does the energy for that person come from? And I think it comes from like these kind of connections to other people and these collective structures, but it's like, I think it can be hard for someone in that position to even begin to like look for those like things to grab onto. Like you're really just like, you have 5 minutes and it's like, yeah. It's just something, that's an open question, but yeah.
Well, I asked myself a question a lot about what would it look like if we won? Like how would we co-govern the world? Like how would we possibly find time and energy for that? And I think, there are two answers. One is you invest in it. Same way we invest in our governance structures offline. We invest in paying our, in my town, we're going to be probably voting to up the pay for our city council this election. And, that's provisioning, as feminist economists call it, for governance. And second is we design our systems humanely, around each other's attention, respectful of each other's attention. And the question that I think we begin to wonder about is, how would we do that? How would we again design attention economies if we actually had the chance?
Yeah. Should we do questions? Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you.
If there's been a demise of third places, right? And there's been such a increase in digital platforms, and is that a coincidence, or did it just happen at the same time, or and what could you say about that?
Yeah, I think it's I don't really. I think the relationship between those two is probably complex, but I don't think it's a coincidence. I do talk a little bit in How to Do Nothing about both sort of like parks and libraries, but also the parks and libraries of the self as being these kind of threatened spaces. I will just mention, speaking of Luddites earlier, there is a group in New York of like young high school students basically called the Luddite Club. There was a New York Times article about them. There's a documentary being made about them right now by their former public school teacher. But I've met them, some of them, and they seem very invested in reclaiming or like finding third spaces that maybe they didn't necessarily. I mean, this is also a generation that was, the pandemic was such a big part of their upbringing. So a lot of really important years or time in their life was spent online. Like everything was mediated through social media, and so they're like sort of rediscovering like where do we go? It's like Prospect Park I think a lot of time for them. But like, what do we do there? What are these other activities? And something that I think I kind of hoped when I wrote How to Do Nothing was that it would prompt this sort of like the kind of like looking around like, hey, wait a minute, like, where are those spaces? Can we create those spaces? Like, I actually really need that because I feel like something that I've seen, I mean, even that gardening group, the native plant group that I mentioned, like people go to that and they're like, oh God, this feels so much better. It's also one of the few places that I know of where there is a lot of intergenerational contact. That's not a school and it's not a nuclear family. So I don't know about the relationship necessarily. Like I don't have a pat answer to that, but I do think that certainly if one is threatened, like third spaces are threatened, people are going to then maybe go onto these online spaces looking for that thing that's missing and not finding it necessarily.
And I think they can learn from each other. There's an organization called New Public that premises their work on learning lessons from offline public spaces like libraries and parks, and then applying them in online spaces. How can we just re-import, rethink, relearn those habits of being together that we've cultivated over a long, over centuries. And yet I think it's also, this loss that you're talking about is a convergence, right? And it has to do with this concept of the Californian ideology. It goes back to the 90s. A couple of Brits were noticing like some weird ideas coming out of California where people were building technology, and they called it the Californian ideology. And a big idea that was floating around in that time was that technology would replace politics, that we would no longer need, say, political parties and differences of, debates over policy and this sort of thing. Like the internet would just help us figure out what the right solution is to everything. Like we would no longer need those public spaces because we would have the internet, a more efficient way of being together, right? And I think it's out of that, that ideology was built of two things. Like one was that desire to shrink the space of the public, right? And very much this has been a movement accompanied by what goes by the name of neoliberalism, a belief that private spaces are the real problem solvers in our life, and that competition and markets and investment are the drivers of solutions. And then finally, on top of that, this desire that this idea that we can come in and supplant those spaces that we once had and had to invest in and had to pay for with digital spaces that are seemingly free. And so I think that connection runs very deep, and it's not just a kind of coincidence of structures, but is actually built into how the ideologies behind the development of a lot of our technologies, the assumptions built into them.
I would also add one other thing, which is that I am a child of the suburbs, and as I said, I grew up like Cupertino, San Jose, and it's something I write about in Saving Time is working in an amusement park. I used to draw caricatures. My employee ID is actually in the book. But I used to draw caricatures at Paramount's Great America, and then I would leave and I would drive home and I'd feel like the entire town was an amusement park. Like nothing felt real. Cupertino is like a very ahistorical place. It doesn't really have a lot of traces of its history. The Apple campus is there. Like my mom worked at the HP that was there before. That was there, that like no one remembers even that. And I think it's almost like those trees that you see that are like shaped by the wind or something. Like I grew up like so longing for like what I didn't even know was a third space. Like I didn't even have the language for that. And I also mentioned in Saving Time, it's this chapter about leisure and the sort of like capture of leisure, that my friends and I in high school would go to this place called Santana Row that had just been built. This was like 2003. And it was built to look like a vaguely European town. And I know that because I went on the Wayback Machine and I went to like santanarow.com, and it was like a vibrant European style, like downtown. That's just like, they just plopped it in the middle of Cupertino, or I think that might technically be in San Jose. And it was pretty much only built because like people there had a lot of money and they want a place to like park their Lamborghini or something, or like be seen. Like it wasn't really about conviviality. And like they were all luxury stores, so they weren't anything that we could afford. And we would just wander around there and be so bored. And it was like, this is the best we can get, And so I feel like my whole, like everything I've done since then has been like a reaction to that upbringing, and sort of like, how can I find the alternative of this? Like I'm looking for the third space, both online and offline.
So I feel like there's this really common narrative online that like younger people these days don't read, and kind of at the beginning of the talk, you're talking about how like certain values are kind of like dying, so to speak, and we're sort of seeing this in people's relationships to their phones. And I think like reading is a really important way of resisting that. And so like as two writers and also two teachers, like I was kind of wondering like what you do to bring like younger people into the fold and to kind of see them and like meet them where they're at and bring these values to them.
Yeah, I mean, that used to be a lot easier for me when I was teaching because that was my job, and I was around younger people for 8 years. One of the things that I tried to do in that class, because essentially my class was like a glorified breadth requirement. Like these were not only not art majors, they were non-humanities majors, and they were under a lot of pressure to do things in the right way. And so, it was on the quarter system, so I had 10 weeks to like try to create a space that felt like where they could experiment with things, where they could bring a different part of themselves to the projects that, that maybe they weren't used to putting into their work, and really like make it a communal thing, like where everyone feels invested in everyone else's work. And like that in itself, like as just a form of attention was, I think, really, I think for some of them it was really helpful. And it certainly informed my work, like trying to create that. Now it's like, I'm like kind of removed. And so it's actually like that question is kind of top of mind for me, like lately, where I'm like, I don't know like what those channels are anymore. And I go around like banging this drum about intergenerational contact like all the time in both directions. Like the amount of wisdom and the type of wisdom that I have absorbed from people who are much like twice my age, but also like somewhere in between, is incredible. But also, I'm just thinking about that group, the plant group that I'm in. There's a high school student in it, and I remember I was talking to someone about something about like the pandemic and how hard it was for people's attention, and I like suddenly realized that he was like listening really carefully to me, and I was almost like not prepared for that. I was like, oh no, I'm not dispensing wisdom, but I think that there's like this, like that group is this like really rare for me and beautiful example of like all the directions that because he also brings something to the group that no one else has. And so I think that's another reason for that third spaces are so important, especially ones where you could have those connections, because I'm really realizing how it really is just like schools and families. It's like these are the lines of transmission that we have, and those are bound up with all kinds of baggage around authority and like all of the stuff. So, yeah.
I love it when I have older students or auditors in my classes that just to mix up the age and the experience and the kinds of habits. And I do think that this like trend is real. The real anxiety around reading an entire book is something I encounter. And I think a big part of it is our testing regime. We've moved toward an educational system that is profoundly focused on continual testing. And book reading is not something that tests, it doesn't prepare you for a multiple choice test as efficiently as something else. And I think that's a real disservice. One other element, though, is my own maturity. When I started teaching, I would show up with like the longest reading list you can imagine, because I had this feeling like, I need to just cram as much as I possibly can. So like tons of little articles, because I want you to like be exposed to all of this different stuff that I think is cool, and it never worked. And I'm trying to slow myself down as a teacher, and I've now gotten to the point where I in most classes try to make sure we read at least one book start to finish, and that we start classes with close reading. So we start out putting down our screens and we all just like read something together and discuss it. So we do the big and the small, because I think those both are skills that folks aren't getting right now in a lot of ways. And I hope that by the time I finish, all of my classes are reading one book twice, like that depth and that patience and that willingness on my part to like let go of everything else and just focus on one thing. But it's not just hard for them, it's hard for me.
Thank you. Jenny, I've just loved both books, so I really want to thank you, and I haven't read yours yet. I hope to. so much you've both said, and I can really relate more easily, I think, to the things you're saying in terms of the attention that we can have. We can choose where we put our attention, and we can make space to have conversations with people. That's simple and sometimes difficult, but I think that's something I really focus on. But I also focus on the collective idea because, you know, and again, this is for me getting older, and not when I was in my 20s at all. I was a mess, and I feel like maybe that's true for a lot of the college students I work with. They feel like kind of a mess, and some of it is part of that age of trying to figure out who you are. So it was true for me 40 years ago as it is now. So maybe things are worse, maybe, I don't know. But, you know, I'm just saying there's something to time also, and perhaps maturity. But I've gotten closer to realizing how difficult and messy it is to work with other people, and that you tell a story when you're young that you're supposed to do it all yourself. At least that's, I think, what our society tells us. So I felt like a failure in that I couldn't figure that out. And it's only over years I realized, oh, this is the good stuff when you're actually just have all these sort of whatever flawed human beings that you're trying to do something that you care about with. Whether it's, I'm not saying people you work with are flawed, but just the, you know, the gardening, or, you know, part of a couple of organizations locally that we try to do good things. And there's pleasure in that difficulty. It's extremely messy. So I don't know if it's a statement or just putting it together, or a question, is our freedom really just caring and caring about place, you know, place and other people. We can all do that in small ways. And so maybe a reflection on that in any way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was interesting for me when I was teaching at Stanford was I felt like my students reminded me so much of people I went to high school with, which was not far from there. And I think a lot of people went to Stanford. So it was a public school, but it just happened to be, it had the sort of like almost punitive intensity of like a private school. It was like very much expected that you would get into a fancy school. And there was a lot of talk about that. It was so much so that my school had an inverted social pyramid where like the nerds were cool and people like made fun of the cheerleaders. Like it was very strange. And a lot of first generation families, like my school is actually majority Asian American. So it's just like a lot of, you know, like cultural things and pressure and a lot of being expected to do everything by yourself. And I was part of that. Like I experienced that. And I went to Berkeley and I ended up having a very different experience, I think. But so when I was getting these students at Stanford, I was like, oh, right, I know about the earlier part of the story, I think. And how it's almost like even beyond asking for help or being connected to other people as a failure, it's like it doesn't even occur to you. And like that's something I feel like I'm still learning that as an adult. Like you're so far down this road. I mean, I was talking about the blinders earlier, right? Like you're just like, oh, but like how can I do this? And you're like not looking like here and here, or like pulling back and being like, maybe actually this is something that would be really amazing with 2 other people or 5 other people. And yes, you would have less control, but in some ways a lot more freedom and a lot more power. And so I think that that's definitely part of, in a way, like also this like testing culture, right? It's a lot to do with educational spaces and the kind of like the values that are being taught like between the lines there.
Yeah, you know, I have small kids, and one conversation that I have with a lot of my friends who also have small kids is around our parents. Like, what role do they play in this dynamic? And one thing that we keep noticing is this sense of tension among our parents, who are like baby boomer generation, of like wanting to be profoundly independent, and yet also recognizing themselves now as like grandparents and people who are still attached right? That they were sold a dream of like the boundless independence of retirement, and then suddenly they're like, oh wait, I actually really want to have a relationship with my grandkids. And it's a really interesting tension to observe, and it's got me back to thinking about something I learned from the Stanford professor Fred Turner, brilliant scholar of the development of tech culture and 20th century American culture in general. In his book, The Democratic Surround, he talks about the way in which there was a concerted effort to cultivate cultural artifacts, to invest in Hollywood and in literature, visions based around the idea that individualism was the strongest defense against communism, right? A kind of Cold War ideology in which the cultivation of independence and freedom would be the antidote to the temptations of communism. And when you look back at like every Disney movie, every like piece of culture I ingested growing up, you have that narrative. Find yourself, stand out from the crowd. Who are you, right? This is not the only way to tell a story. There are other stories about like accountability to people and solidarity. I mean, in 1955, the two films came out. One on the waterfront, which won the won Best Picture, directed by a McCarthyist snitch, about a labor union where finally at the end the workers decide to forget about the oppressive union and rush into the arms of the boss as liberated individuals. And at the same time, a movie called The Salt of the Earth came out that was about Mexican-American mine workers organizing a strike against an oppressive boss. That film, rather than receiving the Best Picture, was banned across the country, and the star, who was an actual, the actors were workers, was deported. A very intentional cultivation of certain kinds of narratives against other kinds of narratives. Salt of the Earth is a great film. You can tell great stories in other kinds of ways, but we have been taught in ways we don't recognize to value a certain kind of narrative above others, and many of us have just ingested that without recognizing it.
Can I add a film, a recent film that everyone should watch called Vivarium? It's from Joe, what year is it from? 2010s, late 2010s. Sorry to put you on the spot. I will not say anything other than it is a horror. It's a ridiculous, over-the-top horror film that is like the best depiction I've ever seen of suburban social alienation. Like if someone was like unfamiliar with the concept of alienation in a social economic context, you just watch Vivarium. It's super depressing, but I love that film. And I was just thinking about it because it's almost like the inverse. Like it's a horror film about individualism. Yeah.
So I think that's all the time that we have for tonight. I want to thank Nathan and Jenny for a very fascinating conversation, and I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening.